Anderson is parking and on her way in, but it's about 2:13, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to our second Local Option Sales Tax Study Committee. And what we'll do today is we'll hear presentations from ACCG, and feel free to ask questions. Stuart Morelli from Legislative Council is here to make sure we stay on target and keep us legal for less. As Legislative Council, and then we've got our Senate press team. If we could, let's just give them a round of applause from traveling from the Capitol to Savannah to get us hooked up and set up. And we'll let ACCG present. If you have questions, we'll answer them, at that time. And appreciate you all coming to the great city of Savannah to hang out with us. And while we're waiting on Senator Anderson to come in, if you all would help me, members of the committee, look at your calendar and give me a couple dates that you could text me that we could have our next meeting within the next 2 or 3 weeks. We'd like to coordinate that. So our next meeting will be in Spalding with Chairman Davis. Spalding is going to gladly host us, and I think his manager's right behind me. So we'll come from the city of Savannah and come back up north, go to Spalding, and our last stop will be in Atlanta to wrap up and review the report and kind of go from there. If y'all could just take a moment and do that. Want to make sure everybody can make it on the committee to the next one. Just not the 1st of November. I think we got an all-day ethics hearing that day. If you're on ethics, which none of y'all are, but are you the attorney president? We're gonna be there all day. That's so exciting. Yeah, either of the 2 weeks, just any day, not the 1st, because we'll be in Atlanta from 9 to 5. We can, if you want to just text me kind of what your 3 options are, and we'll do an any, mini, miny, mo, and grab it from there. Because if you tell me, I want y'all to know I will forget. So, and that way you can just put pencil like hold on your calendar right now, so your admins don't book anything. And yes, we'll have to travel to Griffin Spalding. So, I'm excited about that. Well, I think Senator Anderson must have got lost in the parking lot. We'll go ahead if y'all look at those dates. Like all committee meetings in the Senate, we'll get started, and I'll ask Manager Jay Melder to open us up with a word of prayer, and then we'll move into our presentations from ACCG.
Thank you, Senator. Dear Lord, we thank you for the continued blessings you bestow upon the state of Georgia and our communities. We thank you for the leaders that have gathered here today to continue to address the central question that you most famously posed: give up to Caesar what is Caesar's. And we're here with our skill and our abilities to try to determine that for the Georgia people and for the people of our counties and for our municipalities. We pray for peace, and we pray for the protection of the servicemen and women of the United States military who are across the globe and here locally, serving in our name and in your name, dear Lord, for the peace and protection of our country. Thank you for our abilities to be here today and discuss this wonderful opportunity for our state. In your name, we give thanks. Amen.
Amen. And to my left, Senator Russ Goodman will also be taking autographs, and will be available for bookings to give his official count. Okay, he's not 8 by 10s, but he will be giving his official count of his experience and time in Israel. He's back, and so he's also welcome to host a group to go back, but you have to get your own way there and back. He's not going with you, he'll just call you. So we're excited to have Senator Russ Goodman back, and his mom, they made it back safely while they were in Israel. It's always an interesting day when you read your AJC email that says Senator is in Israel, and I said, I'm not even going to text him because I'm just going to pray for him and pray that they make it back safe. And so he's back with us and here at the Local Option Sales Tax Senate Study Committee. So let's just give Russ a little round of applause. He's so excited to see you. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome members of the Association of County Commissions, and what's the last one on the G, like government? ACCG to come and give us our presentation today.
Thank you, Chairman Mallow, members of the Senate Law Study Committee. We appreciate you all allowing ACCG to speak today. Fortunately, I don't think loss negotiations are quite as contentious as what they're dealing with over there in the Middle East, but counties and cities, in some places, it does get fairly contentious, so we do appreciate you looking at this. At the end of the day, local governments want to go about their business and provide the local services that their citizens demand, and it's best if they stay out of the newspaper, and obviously when they're fighting in public, it doesn't look good for anybody. So I think one of our goals is to look at the current system and why sometimes there's disputes over this pot of money. And so today, we're going to start with sort of a history. Y'all didn't get a history at the first meeting, but I think it's always important to sort of back up and say, okay, what was the General Assembly thinking when they created this loss tax? And then walk all the way through till where we're at today. So we'll start with the history, and then we'll talk about some of the current problems with the current process, and then we'll wrap up with some potential solutions for y'all to look at. We do have a couple of our county managers and the county attorney here today. They're going to speak more from a local perspective and talk about the experience they personally had. So we've got Byron Lombard. He's the county manager in Greene County. We've got John Hart, the attorney for Chatham County, and Heather Scott. She's the manager in Jeff Davis County. So sort of two smaller counties and a larger county perspective. They all had difficult negotiations. So y'all will hear from them at the end. I'm gonna have Dante come up here in a second. Dante Handel on our team. He's going to cover the history. Y'all feel free to ask us any questions as we go along. We want to make sure y'all sort of understand the timeline of how things have progressed. I'm going to start, though, with sort of a big question that is going to be before you all. I want you all to think about this question today as we're... So, when the original loss law was created, it was a formula-driven system. There was no negotiation. It was really about property tax relief. We went back into the historical records and looked at some of the conversations that were taking place. The General Assembly clearly at the time meant for this to be about property tax relief. In fact, there was actually some debates on how to give the property tax relief. So the governor at the time, Governor George Busbee, he wanted the system where we rolled back, we split it based on population. The counties gave a rollback in the unincorporated area, cities gave a rollback inside the cities, which is what actually got into the original law. We had a Chairman Collins of the Ways and Means Committee. He didn't want to do it like that. He actually wanted the state to collect the full penny of sales tax and give it back like you all are giving back HCRG this year. You know, the HCRG grant credit, the $1 billion that y'all voted on. He had envisioned a system like that where the state would give the property tax relief back to all the citizens, not the counties and cities. And of course, the governor went out in that discussion, and the way the original loss law was developed is it was a formula, and the money went straight to the counties and cities based on that formula. So we're going to talk about that. But getting back to this decision, so there's kind of two ways we can approach this. One, we can try to improve the current negotiations. So clearly the current negotiations don't work, and they cause a lot of hard feelings in a lot of places. So we can try to improve on those negotiations. And quite frankly, I'll be honest with you, that's probably where we're going to get the most consensus between GMA and ACCG. As far as our members and GMA members, we can probably get most of our members to agree that, hey, an improvement to the existing negotiations is a good thing. Second option is to forget what the governments are getting, right? You know, one government fighting another government over a limited pot of money, and go back to, well, how do we just give this back to the property taxpayers? Do some sort of formula that's equitable. So all property taxpayers, whatever you all, we can talk about equity and ways to do it, but at the end of the day, how do we give it back to property taxpayers in a way that everybody's getting the same benefit off their property tax bill? And that would probably require some kind of a formula. And I can tell you, there is no formula that's going to satisfy everybody. You're going to make probably about half the people upset with any kind of formula. GMA, we've had these discussions. We've talked about formulas. We've got some good ones. I'll mention some at the end today. But at the end of the day, probably half my members, half his members, they're not going to like it because they're going to run the numbers, right? And they're going to see where they stand. And if they come out to the better, they'll support the formula. But if it takes money away from them, they're not going to be supportive of the formula. So again, the way it's looked at today is kind of a government to government. What is my government getting to support my budget versus what's the other government's getting to support their budget? But the other way to look at it is, what are the taxpayers getting at the end of the day? So keep that question in mind as we move through the presentation. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and call Dante Handel up here to give a history of loss. And then when he's done, we'll talk about some of the problems with negotiations, and then we'll mention some potential solutions. Dante?
Thank you, Clint. Good afternoon, Chairman Mallow, members of the committee. Appreciate your time this afternoon. So, my name is Dante Handel with ACCG, and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the history of loss. So, in 1975, that's when the original loss law was enacted to provide property tax relief. So, we're using sales tax to offset property tax for the citizens. That law was later amended in 1976, and then there were a handful of court cases that changed the course of loss and kind of helps morph into what it ends up being today. So 1978 is the first major court case I'd like to talk to you all about. That case is Martin versus Ellis. So that one struck down the differential rollback as unconstitutional due to uniformity concerns. So original loss law, the county portion is being used to roll back in the unincorporated area only, and the city portion is being used to roll back in the incorporated area only. So that court case ended up changing it so that the city residents are now receiving a double rollback. So the county would have to roll back countywide, not just in the unincorporated area, and then the city would still provide a rollback in the incorporated area. And later, in 1979, next major court case, City Council of Augusta versus Mangelli. So that court case ultimately declared loss unconstitutional, and the central issue at hand there was whether or not allowing a portion of the proceeds of the county tax to be distributed to the cities was constitutional or not. Ultimately, distribution to the cities failed as an unconstitutionally improper purpose of taxation. So the General Assembly had to go back and take another look at that law in 1979. That's when the General Assembly passed a new loss law. This time it was a joint county-city tax. It fixed some of those constitutional issues requiring a countywide property tax rollback. But it was really intended to be a stopgap measure until the General Assembly could go back and pass a constitutional amendment to restore that original formula. Now, a year later, in 1980, next case is Taylor County versus Cooper. So the Supreme Court upheld the 79 loss law, the constitutional authority provided by supplemental powers and special district provisions. There's no equal protection or due process problems on the basis that some areas received a greater benefit than other areas, and that the local negotiation was not an unlawful delegation of power. Then in 1994, we see that the new loss legislation requires periodic renegotiation. That's where the 8 criteria that we have today are added to the law. And since we have that required periodic renegotiation, the next year in 1995, that's when we have the original required negotiation. So the two sides have always been able to renegotiate. That's where it was required after the 94 law. And so that's the first negotiation, 1997, the service delivery strategy law goes into effect. And then in 2002, after the decennial census, that's where we have the first required negotiation following the census. So later on in 2009, baseball arbitration was introduced where the two sides each would submit their best offer, and ultimately one would be selected. 2013 case, Turner County versus the City of Ashburn threw out baseball arbitration, so that's following the 2012 renegotiations after that decennial census. And then in 2014, previous agreements protected and the process for lost appeals amended. 2019, ACCG and GMA were working on negotiating with each other about Lost, and then in 2020 we had the pandemic that put those negotiations on hold, and they weren't resumed until 2023. So 2022, last year, is when we had the next round of negotiations after the decennial census, so every 10 years. And then in 2023, the two associations are working together, trying to improve the process. And I'd like to turn it back over to Clint if y'all don't have any questions.
Does anyone have any questions about sort of that history, that timeline that Dante outlined? We started with a purely population-based formula, real simple, easy to calculate. Went to a rollback in the unincorporated area from the county, a rollback from your city, and then through these series of court cases, they had to change the law to keep it constitutional, to keep the whole law from being thrown out. And we never have put another formula back in place, but they did come back and put a mandatory negotiation in place. And that's where we're at today, this mandatory every year, 10-year negotiation that we're doing. Okay. We're going to talk now about some of the problems with the current negotiation. First of all, everybody knows this is a zero-sum game, right? There's a fixed pot of money that's collected in sales tax in your community, and you got to split it between the county and all the cities. So any dollar that one side gets as an increase means it has to come from somebody that's getting a dollar deduction. So that's one thing that makes these negotiations difficult, because there's always somebody that's losing money in their budget if somebody else gains some dollars in their budget. Keeping laws from terminating always trumps making it more equitable. So we've heard this over and over again. People think there's a change that needs to happen, right? But at the end of the day, and you're going to hear from some presenters today where this has happened in their county. They fought really hard, but at the end of the day, they could not reach a consensus, and nobody wanted to let the tax terminate. So what they did is they just kind of left it like it was. It's not that they were happy with the way it's been. They really thought that a change was due, right? But obviously, whatever side was going to lose some money did not want that to happen. Whoops. And so they wind up leaving it like it is, right? They fight for months and months and then leave it like it is. Because there's too big of a risk. Again, the penalty is you lose the tax, which means all your taxpayers lose this property tax relief on their tax bill, which is going to probably get everybody in office thrown out. It doesn't really matter whose fault it is. Nobody wants to, as a political figure, you don't want to have that happen on your watch, right? So you try to negotiate, but at the end of the day, if it comes down to the wire and you're faced with not getting what you want or the tax lapsing, you just go and kind of take what you can get. Every government does not have an equal seat at the negotiating table. I'm not sure why this keeps cutting off on me. Apologize. You think about the negotiations. So I'm going to give you two examples. Let's take Fulton County this year. So Fulton County, one of our largest counties in the state, they're almost completely municipalized. They only have a small sliver of industrial property that's left in the unincorporated area. Well, they were only getting like less than 5% or so of the tax. So that's a huge county. The little bit of lost money they were getting in their budget was minuscule compared to their budget. So they really didn't have anything to lose and everything to gain. So you can imagine the cities going to that negotiation, and they're negotiating with the county that's saying, we're going to need more. And oh, by the way, if we tell you we're ready to let this thing lapse and go to a host or whatever, that's a credible threat, because we can absorb this loss in our budget without doing any harm. You all can't absorb that loss, and we know it. So that's the case of sort of the county sort of having some leverage over the cities. Now, I'm going to give you the reverse. Let's take Forsyth County, which is north of Fulton County. They've got one city, the city of Cumming. They represent about 3% of the county population, but they're the only city in the whole county. So the county's got to get agreement with that city, but it's only 3% of the population. Everybody else lives outside the city. Well, they were getting closer to 15% of the money, even though they were 3% of the population, and they wanted to keep that 15%. What do? The county can't afford to lose the sales tax. They get the bulk of the money. So that city really has a lot of leverage in that negotiation. And then we have this thing called absent municipalities. These are cities that are small that they don't have to sign the agreement. They're not required to sign on. So the default formula for them is they get a population share of what the larger cities negotiate on their behalf. So they really don't have any say-so, right? Because the large city and the county can kick them out of the negotiations at any time. They can say, look, we don't really care what you think. We're going to give you your population share of the municipal share of this, and go on home, we'll tell you when we've got it resolved. So they don't really have much of a seat at the table. So again, when you look at who's at the table here, it's not always starting from a level playing field. Inertia, again, we see a lot of people just leaving it like it is because that's the easier thing to do than to try to explain why a change is needed. It's at the end of the day, it's easier to say, we'll just continue to do what we did the last 10 years. There are side agreements from past negotiations. A lot of times those are lost or forgotten. In other words, sometimes maybe 20 years ago, one side got more lost money because they took over, let's say they took over a service like recreation. And so the agreement, the side agreement was, okay, you take over this service and we'll give you more lost money. Well, those elected officials are not in office anymore when the next round of negotiations take place. And people forget. And so they just say, why is that jurisdiction getting so much lost money? They don't deserve that much. They forget that, well, there was a reason why they got more lost money, because they took on a service back then. But they forget about those side agreements. So then you start rehashing things. Well, they don't deserve that kind of money. They need to be more in line with everybody else. There's obviously hired consultants and attorneys that get paid to do this work. And guess what? I've never seen a consultant or attorney that's argued for less for their client. They all argue for at least as much, right? Sometimes it's a defensive posture. Sometimes what they're saying is, we just want to keep getting what we've always gotten. Just don't give us anything less. I've seen that. And I've obviously seen them argue for more. Never seen them say that we deserve less. They're getting paid to represent their client, and they do so well. And they know the law well. They know the law better than probably any of the elected officials that are in the room. And they got all the statistics that they use, and they can spin the numbers any way they want them. And that makes these negotiations really tough and costly. That's where you get into a lot of tax costs to try to pay for these consultants and attorneys. Because I guarantee you what's going to happen is once one side gets a consultant or attorney, guess what? The other side's going to get one, right? They may have not gotten one to begin with, but they hear the other side's getting one. Okay, now we're going to lawyer up. We're going to consultant up and get ours. 8 criteria, we'll get into those here in a little bit, but they're very ambiguous. It's very difficult for you to even understand them. You're going to see a lot of these criteria reference SDS, and you're going to say, well, don't we have an SDS agreement, which is a separate agreement? Yes, but remember, as Dante said in the timeline, that SDS law got passed after these 8 criteria were already in the law, and we never went back and changed the 8 criteria. So really, the loss negotiations were the first SDS negotiation too. We were handling SDS negotiations in our loss negotiations back then, and then we created that separate negotiation, but never went back and changed the loss law. The negotiations do not usually focus on tax equity. Again, it's really, at the end of the day, it's more about how's this going to affect my budget? How's this going to affect my services? Not so much is all the taxpayers getting the same amount of tax relief. I'll talk a little bit, since this came up at the first meeting, a little bit about host. And I think the comment at the first meeting was host was being used by some counties as a threat. Like, if you don't negotiate with me on loss, that's fine. We'll let it lapse and we'll move to a host. So I'm going to address that later on in the presentation. And then at the end of the day, it's political in a lot of places, right? We're dealing with elected officials representing their constituents. You all are elected. A lot of you all are elected officials here. How many of you all want to tell your constituents that you got them less money, or that you know, because of your work on a committee, now they're getting less property tax relief because you had to give some money to the other side? Nobody wants to be in that position. And so you may even internally sometimes think, yeah, the other side's got a really good argument, maybe we should give up some money. But at the end of the day, I don't want to give up anything. I want to at least get what I used to have. And so a lot of this stuff is political. So there's really no like justification. It's just like, okay, we used to get 36%, and we expect to continue to get 36%. And we don't have to bring any evidence to the table. So that's just a real snapshot of some of the things that we see that make these negotiations real contentious. Now I'm going to get into some of the criteria, and we're going to walk you through the criteria and how they're worded and just how confusing they are for the elected officials that have to consider it. Yes, Chairman.
Just a quick question. I know we were talking percentages, and so in the percentages, have we maybe discussed that when, for example, collections are up? What if you didn't have large collections, maybe your percentage at loss was this dollar amount. Is there any weight or conversation about when collections are higher and you see a larger portion dollar-wise? Because when you say budget, we're talking dollars that were budgeted.
Right.
But if collections are up, then budgeted dollars will be more because collections are higher. So how does collections, factor into this conversation?
So that's a good question, and it does factor into the conversations. And so what I see is that, because this is done once every 10 years, and you're kind of stuck with it after that for 10 years. So, but in some of the negotiations, I have seen people sort of use past projections, like this has been our historic growth in sales tax, and then they adjust the percentages over multiple years. So maybe one side is going to give up 5%, so another side can gain 5%. What they'll do is they'll say, okay, based on our revenue projections, we're growing at about 2% a year. So we can absorb that 5% loss without actually absorbing any real dollar loss in our budget if we gradually do this, say, over a 3-year period. So we'll lose a third of it the first year, a third of it the second year, and the final third the third year. But if historic trends hold, we won't really lose any dollars because our sales tax is growing enough that we're going to keep the same amount of dollars in our budget, even though we're losing 5%. Does that make sense? So that's what they do. That's where I've seen it. So before I actually get into the specific criteria, I just want to be thinking about these when I go through the criteria. But first of all, it's a non-exclusive list. These are, and the law just says you have to consider these things. It does not say you have to use it. It doesn't give any priority over, okay, you use this one, but this is the most important one, and this is the second most important one. It doesn't even give a weighting. Okay, we weight this one more heavier than that one. It just says consider these things. And then, oh, by the way, you can consider anything else. So consider this, and then consider anything else you want to consider. Which that doesn't give a lot of direction or guidance when it's that kind of language. Some of the criteria may have more value to others, and we see this in negotiations. Like the cities will pick the criteria that they think are most advantageous to them, and the counties will pick the criteria that's most advantageous to them, and that's the ones they argue. We should use these criteria. Well, why? Well, because the real reason is because it's more advantageous to them to use that criteria. Some are more relevant than others. If it's about property tax relief, you think statistics about how much property tax relief you're giving would be more relevant to the discussion, but that's not really what happens. Some are easier to measure. Some of them are very difficult to measure. We'll get into some of that too. Again, no guidance on which ones to use, how to weight them, how to measure them. There's no definitions, so we get arguing over what is point of sale, what is daytime population, what is economic benefit. So all those things get argued over in negotiations. So I think my point is the 8 criteria, instead of being helpful guidance, they tend to just confuse the process even more and give more ammunition to both sides to argue. So here are the criteria. We're going to walk through them. So you'll see the first one, which is a lengthier one, talks about the service delivery responsibilities of each political subdivision to the population served. Think about that. We have a lot of different populations we serve for each type of service. I've got counties that have countywide services. We have counties that do some of their services only in the unincorporated area. We got some counties that do their services in the unincorporated area and in some cities, but not all of the cities. We got cities that provide services outside of the city boundaries into the unincorporated area. So if you look at it service by service, we got a different population set potentially for every single service we're looking at. Think how complex and confusing that's going to be when we have to line up. We don't even have population numbers for some of our service areas. If you think about a service area that you've drawn to provide, say, fire service, well, the census doesn't acknowledge our service districts. They're not giving us population statistics. Do we have population statistics for those service areas? No. We're having to guess. Maybe you can guess at it. I don't know. But we don't even know what the population is for some of these service areas, other than maybe the property tax bills and, again, guessing how many people live in a household. I don't know how we get to some of these population numbers. And then what really gets confusing is read the last part of this. The inherent value of the community of the central business district and the unincorporated areas of the county and the obligation of all residents of the county for the maintenance and prosperity of the central business district and the unincorporated areas of the county. What does that mean, the inherent value? So, Senator Goodman, you're in agriculture. I would argue that if you didn't have all those farms in the unincorporated area, you probably wouldn't have a city there, right? If you didn't have if the ag industry dried up overnight, would that city still exist? So that would, you can look at, hey, the unincorporated area has a huge value to the central business district. You have key customers because of the farms. Vice versa, the central business district would say, well, if we didn't have a central business district, you'd have to go to a neighboring county or another city to shop. But because we have a central business district, that's where the grocery store is located. That's where the convenience stores are located. So we produce economic, we're the quote economic engine because we have all the stores and commerce. Well, again, they may have the retail stores and commerce, but in the unincorporated area, you have a different kind of commerce. It's not retail, but it's still just as vital to the community, right, to support the local economy. And so that gets real confusing. You can argue about that all day. Who's more valuable, and they're both valuable at the end of the day. So number 2, service delivery responsibilities of each political subdivision to the resident population of the subdivision. Well, that's actually one of the easier ones, right? We can take census numbers, which is based on resident population, and we can sort of calculate that. But here's the problem with resident population. A lot of times in the negotiations, the counties only are given credit for the unincorporated population, but they serve the city residents too, right? Those city residents receive county services, sometimes disproportionately. Like a library may be located in the city, and maybe more city residents use the library, but the county's paying for the library. So you got to look at, if you're again talking about population served, for a lot of the county services, it's countywide population. And even if you use resident population for the county, whether you live in a city or not, you're still a resident of the county. The existing service delivery responsibilities of each political subdivision. What does that sound like? SDS, service delivery strategy? Remember, that was prior to SDS, but that's exactly what we do in service delivery strategy negotiations. So we're already doing this in a separate negotiation. We're talking about the service delivery responsibilities of each political subdivision. We give that to the Department of Community Affairs. We have to tell them, here are all the services we provide in our county and all our cities, and where they're providing the services and how we're paying for them. That's a separate negotiation now, but it's still here in the law school, so it gets rehashed a second time. Existing service delivery, let's see, the effect of a change in sales tax distribution on the ability of each political subdivision to meet short-term and long-term debt. Fortunately, in our state, we don't have a lot of debt. I mean, we have things like tax anticipation notes and leasing and some of those things, but that's not truly debt. Debt is like GEO-bond debt, where you're pledging the full faith and credit of the taxing powers of the jurisdiction to pay back debt. We don't have a lot of counties and cities taking out GEO-bond debt, so it's not. That's really, in my opinion, not a really big issue that they're going to fail to be able to pay off their debt due to a change in the loss allocation. This is a popular one: point of sale and use, which generates the tax to be apportioned. I don't know who put this in law, but they obviously did not consult with our state Department of Revenue, because in Georgia, we are not a point-of-sale state. We are what we call a point-of-destination. That's how we situs the sale in Georgia. And you may say, well, what's the difference in a point-of-sale situs versus a point-of-destination situs? Well, I'll tell you. Let's take a Home Depot. I live in Cherokee, and the Home Depot I shop at is in Cobb. Well, if I go to that Home Depot store and basically buy anything in that store and walk out with it, my sales tax is going to Cobb County, not to the county I live in. Now, if I go to that store and sign a contract to have a washing machine or a dishwasher delivered to my house and installed, now they're going to charge me Cherokee sales tax, not Cobb County sales tax. Why? Because I'm not taking that washing machine home with me that day. They're going to send an installer out next week with a truck, and they're going to put it in at my house. So where I receive that is at my house, not at the store. So the sales tax goes to where my house is located. Same with all these internet transactions. You may be buying, who knows where the warehouse is that's sending you that product, but you're not paying sales tax to the county where the warehouse is located, where the product came from. You're paying sales tax based on where they drop that package off, which is usually at your front doorstep. So it goes to that county. They've got it. So that's what I mean by point of destination. We're not point of sale. And also the Department of Revenue, so other than the most tax with the cities that are in Fulton County, every other tax is the county-wide tax shared with the cities. So when a retailer is filling out their sales tax return, they have to apportion all their sales to the 159 counties and then those most cities. But they're not telling the Department of Revenue if the sale occurred inside a city or in the unincorporated area. They're just saying it occurred in that county. So that's all the information that DOR gets. So the DOR has no idea if the sale is attributable to something that happened inside one of the cities or outside of the city. There are multiple cities, obviously, in a lot of counties. They have no idea where it's coming from. So you can talk about point of sale, but there is no data on point of sale. Because again, the point of sale doesn't exist, and even if you did it based on point of destination, you can't even get that information. So you see a lot of people trying to do proxies for this. They'll go in and get data about how much general commerce goes on in their area, or how much retail sales they have in their area, and then that becomes a proxy for this. The existence of intergovernmental agreements among and between political subdivisions, what does that sound like? Again, SDS, that's a type of an agreement between counties and cities. Now, there may be some side agreements outside of SDS, but a lot of this gets captured in your SDS agreement. Use of any political subdivision or property taxes and other revenues from some taxpayers to subsidize the costs and services provided by taxpayers of the levying subdivision. So this gets into what they call double taxation. Well, we address double taxation again in SDS negotiations. But this was prior to the SDS law passing, so they wanted us to address double taxation in this negotiation. So again, we're addressing it in both types of negotiations. And then any coordinated plan of a county or municipal service delivery and financing. Again, what does that sound like? Another coordinated plan of how counties and cities are going to provide their services? That's the SDS negotiation. So you can see throughout these criteria, they keep referring to things that we already do in our SDS negotiations, and which makes this negotiation confusing, because are we rehashing everything we just did in an SDS negotiation? Now we got to talk about it all and argue over it again. And that's what happens at a lot of places. They talk about it every time they get a chance. So as you can see, the 8 criteria are really confusing and don't really lend a lot of guidance to the process. So let's talk a little bit about tax equity. We told you that the original formula was a simple formula, population-based, so residential population, got thrown out by the courts. And then so the county started taking the amount of money it received that was only going to a rollback in the unincorporated area and started providing that rollback to everybody across the whole county. But the amount of money pretty much stayed the same. So what does that mean? If I was giving $2 to the unincorporated area and $0 to my county residents inside the city, now all of a sudden I'm taking that $2 and I left one in the unincorporated area and moved one over to the city. So I just cut theirs about in half. I know that's very simplistic, but that's what's happening. The unincorporated residents got a reduced amount of tax benefit because they had to then use some of those dollars to pay for that tax benefit inside the city. And of course, the cities are still continuing to get money in providing the rollback on the city tax bill. So we actually run the numbers across the whole state, and we gave you a copy of this. We sent it out ahead of time. I think you've got a copy of the data that was put together. And it shows the percentage off the county tax bill and the average percentage off all the city tax bills within that county. So it's, again, how much percent-wise reduction do you get in your property taxes due to this lost sales tax being collected? And what we found is for the counties, this is statewide average here, roughly 22%. So if you didn't have the loss, your property tax bill would go up roughly 22% for not having that offset. For the cities, it's roughly a 49, almost a 50% offset. So if you lived in a city and the loss were to go away, your city taxes would basically almost double. It's about a 50% reduction you're getting due to loss. So you can see that on average, everybody gets the 22% off, right? So whether you live inside the city or you live in the unincorporated area, your county taxes, you get the 22% off your county taxes, because you're paying the county taxes even if you're in the city, right? So you're still getting the 22% reduction on your county taxes inside the city. But in addition to that, you're getting another roughly 49% reduction in your city property taxes. And I'll get to special service districts. They get nothing. Well, we'll talk about that later. Yes?
How do you calculate for the total city ad valorem tax burden when you're talking about a jurisdiction with multiple municipalities? How are you calculating that percentage? an average?
Yeah, it's just an average. We just took all of them and averaged them together.
So just for like a.
But it could be
local-
very different city by city,
Yeah,
yes.
for like a local context, so we have 8 municipalities in Chatham County. One of our municipalities has no millage.
Right, they get 100%.
They get 100%.
Yes.
Which would absolutely throw
The others,
the
yeah.
percentage for that. So that's kind of what I'm asking about.
Yeah.
Comparing apples to apples here, because it is very, idiosyncratic to the makeup of the county and the municipalities.
Yeah, so we actually looked at, and you're right, so I don't think it's on this slide, it's on a later slide, but, so for the counties, we looked at, the smallest amount of reduction was around 2% off the tax bill. That was the worst case scenario. Best case scenario was around a 48% reduction in the county taxes. So that was that's a big range though, between 2% and 48% off. But for the cities, the range was even bigger than that, because it went all the way up from, less than 5% or so off your tax bill, all the way up to 100% off your tax bill, like you said. So there's a bigger range for the cities. But for the case of what we did, we were just taking averages, because we were trying to, again, we took the averages for all the counties in the state, but we also were taking the averages for all the cities in the state.
And do we also look at too, because what I see is sometimes similarities would be a very small municipality that would be able to offset all of its millage rate with their lost proceeds, compared to smaller unincorporated areas where perhaps their special service district fees or taxes can be completely offset by lost as well. Do you look at that too when you look at when you talk about the county? That's just countywide taxpayer M&O?
Yeah, see, it's just countywide. I was going to get to this later in the program, but we don't give any offset on special service districts.
Well, you're not supposed to.
Right, you're not legally allowed to.
That's right.
Yeah, it's not that we
But
don't just
there
do
are-
something, do it. We
There are ways
can't.
to do it.
Yeah, so like I live in a county that I receive my fire service through an unincorporated service district, and roughly my millage rate for fire is about 4 mils. My county millage rate, countywide millage rate is about 6 mils. So that's a pretty substantial amount, 4 mils.
Yeah.
Well, I get zero rollback on my 4 mils due to lost. But the people in the city that get their fire from the city, they do get a lost rollback on their fire.
Right.
But, so the reason is they can get the lost rollback on their fire because they're paying for it out of their city general M&O levy, where mine's not coming out of the county general M&O levy, therefore the county can't give me a rollback on my lost.
Right. But
Yeah.
those the city taxpayers also pay the county M&O as well.
Yes, but they should only be paying the county M&O for the countywide services,
you
right?
could
It's
look at-
not for things like fire that are not countywide.
But couldn't you look at a city millage similar to a special service district millage?
You
Just
could,
the same.
yeah. We'll get to that later, but I like that. I mean, we like that idea. If you think about a special service district, which provides a lot of those supplemental powers that we'll get to later, you could, if you treated them like a city, I think you'd get a little more equity there, where you could roll back on the special service district like you roll back inside the cities. Yes, I agree with that. So 95% of the counties with a loss, the tax provides greater tax relief to the municipal taxpayer. And again, we sent you the data sheets. If you have any questions on specific data, I think these are the data for the counties that are in your Senate districts. So it's not the entire state. We just looked at the ones inside your Senate districts. The bulk of countywide M&O levy is not supplemental power. So this goes back, and one of the things that happens in the negotiations, because this says it's a holdover from the original law. Remember, when the original law was created, we only got a share based on our unincorporated population. Therefore, you should be using it for those supplemental power services, right? The things that, if you're, it's for a rollback for the unincorporated area, but also to pay for things in the unincorporated area that you don't provide in the city. Well, when the law got changed and we started providing the tax relief countywide, we still have that holdover supplemental powers language. So what some cities will argue is they'll say, see there, you're only supposed to be using this loss for supplemental powers. But we're like, well, legally, how can we use it for supplemental powers? Because we have to put it in our general fund, and that's not where most of our supplemental powers are paid for. Supplemental powers, if you're going by SDS, you should be paying for that out of a special service district, not your general fund, because those are things that compete with cities, right? Cities got their own services. Unincorporated area has its own services. And we're also doing the rollback. So we pay for the rollback out of the general fund. So how can we pay for supplemental services when we're putting in our general fund and doing the rollback out of the general fund? It just doesn't, those two are in conflict. Again, that last bullet point I've already mentioned, we legally cannot, this is what our attorneys have said, because I've asked this question over and over again. I think it would require a change to the law. but we can legally not do a rollback on millage for a special service district because it's not countywide. So let's talk about hosts. So I think this came up in the context at the last meeting of some counties that were threatening, hey, we're going to go to a host if you don't negotiate what we feel like is fair on lost. So first of all, I want to let you know what host is, because some people don't even know what a host is. It's only, by the way, in DeKalb and Rockdale. They're the only two places that have it in the state. And I'll tell you why that is. They, for whatever reason, couldn't pass a loss tax. And then long after the loss went into the law, we passed a host law, and they were eligible to do it, and they were able to get their voters to vote for that. But the law said, for everybody else that has a loss, you're not eligible for host. You can't do a host if you have a loss. And so all these other counties across the state, host has really never even been an option for them to consider because they have a loss. Legally, the law says they can't consider it, right? So now if the law said you can choose between a lost or a host, that would be a different matter, but that's not what the law says. So the only way the host would ever be able to be considered if the lost went away. So what is host? It collects about the same amount of money as lost. There's one big difference, though, where you spread lost out to all your property taxpayers, so commercial, industrial, rental, everybody gets a little bit of tax benefit off of lost. Host, you're targeting your homesteaded properties. What you're saying with host is you're saying, we're going to give priority to the homesteads because those are the people that, they're not making money off the home they're living in. We don't want to tax grandma out of her home. So we're going to put all that tax relief into that type of property only. So what happens is we're like in counties, you can give with lost on average 22% tax reduction. With host, in Rockdale, they're giving 75% reduction. In DeKalb, it's 100% reduction. Significantly more. Same amount of money, but the reason they can give so much more tax relief is because they're not applying it to all types of properties. They're only applying it to the homesteaded properties. So for the homestead owner, if you own a house and that's all you own and it's the house you live in, host is going to be financially a better deal for you than lost. But now for everybody else that owns a farm or owns any other type of property, rental properties, yeah, lost is going to be better for you because at least you get something. You get nothing out of host. So that's kind of the main difference between the two. So there's a capital component to host where you can take 20% off the top and use it for capital before you use the rest for property tax relief. That's kind of changed in DeKalb. That's still the case in Rockdale. DeKalb's gone through 3 iterations of host laws. So they're not operating off the same host law as Rockdale is. They're kind of unique. So I think if any other county ever were to do a host, we've got Gwinnett, Cherokee, and Cobb that don't have a law. So those 3 counties would be eligible for a host. They would be following the Rockdale County model. And the Rockdale County model does not share it with the city. It just goes, the county's the only one that gets it. And they provide that property tax relief to the homesteaded property. But the city resident gets a big chunk of their county property taxes reduced, right? So in Rockdale, 75% of their county property taxes go away because of a host. So it does benefit city residents, but it just doesn't give any money, to the city budget. So loss covers between, I already mentioned this statistic, between 2 and 48% of the county tax burden, but then you see where host is covering 100% and 75% in Rockdale County. So here's the other thing about host. If you were to let the loss lapse, and that's your threat. Okay, lost, we couldn't get tax equity on lost. So we think host is more equitable. Therefore, we want to go to a host because that's what I hear from the counties. If we could get tax equity in lost, we wouldn't be thinking about a host, but because we can't get any tax equity or we feel like we're not getting it, this becomes what we feel like is an equitable way to provide the tax relief. Again, that's their opinion. We know that. But realistically, could they let the lost lapse and pick up a host? Yes, but a lot of things have to happen perfectly for them, which are not likely to happen. And here's the process. Let's say that a county didn't sign the lost agreement that was due in December of 2022, and they let the tax lapse. So January 1 of 2023, there is no more lost. And let's say the county says, okay, now we want to go to a host. Here's what's got to happen. First of all, they got to go the members of their delegation, and get you all to pass a local act. Because with host, you've got two questions on the ballot. One's for the homestead exemption and one's for the tax. So it's a two-part question. You got to pass both of them. Do you want a homestead exemption, blah, 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 and do you want the tax to pay for that? And that, because of the homestead exemption piece of it, they have to get the local act passed. So if the city comes to you and says, whoa, don't you pass that host, they didn't play nice with us in loss negotiations, you better not allow them to have a host. Now your delegation is stuck between your county and your city. And what are you going to do? Are you going to pass the local act? Or are you going to not do anything, right? So the delegation can stop it in its tracks. The county commission, unlike SPLOST and all these other sales taxes we've been talking about where the county has the ability to put it out to referendum, they do not have the ability to put a host out to referendum. They cannot go put a host out to referendum. They have to go through their delegation. Only their legislative delegation has the authority to put that host on the referendum. So that's probably going to stop it right there. So if you do get it past your delegation and get them to pass the local act at the General Assembly, then you got to have the local referendum and your citizens got to pass it. So that would probably happen in November of 2023. Let's say it passes, the citizens want this host and they pass it. Okay, now collections don't begin immediately. They don't begin until April of 2024. And then the law says you got to collect for a full calendar year before you can provide tax relief. So collecting for the rest of 2024 is not enough. You got to collect all of the rest of 2024 and all of 2025. And then, only then at the end of 2026, when those property tax bills go out at the end of 2026, then you can finally provide some host tax relief on those property tax bills, only to homesteaded properties. So tell me, what elected official is going to make that gamble? What elected official is going to say, I bet you I can get my delegation to support the host, I can get my citizens to support the host, and then I can get my citizens to wait 4 years for property tax relief from the time loss lapses until I implement my host. I don't know about y'all, but I don't think that's likely to happen anywhere. In fact, in reality, it's never happened anywhere. Whether it could happen, yes, technically it could happen, but the likelihood of that is slim to none. So again, going back to this thread of, hey, if you don't negotiate on loss with me, I'm going to go to a host. Okay, yeah, you can go to a host, but this is what you got to go through to get there. That's not likely to happen. Yes.
Do you believe that for the counties that you saw threaten the host, that those county leaders understood this process?
Well, I don't know. We tried to explain to them. In fact, you're sitting next to one, Chairman Davis. I'd hate to throw you under the bus, but they were looking at the host, and you had me come to your commission meeting, and you invited all the local officials and had me give a presentation on it, right? So we were glad to do that to anybody that asked. And I know that my counterpart, Jim Thornton, and at GMA, we've had these discussions, and I hope that they were advising their city members the same. But that's what I told my counties. I said, that's fine. Go. If you want to threaten, I guess you can do whatever you want to do. But just know that the reality is you're probably never going to be able to do an actual host if it comes down to that, because this is the process you got to go through. Yes.
I can't imagine that your business community nor your agricultural community would appreciate going from a loss to a host.
They wouldn't.
I wouldn't think.
They would probably be fighting. Guess what? And what's going to happen when your ag and commercial folks come to you, Senator, and say, don't you dare pass that local act? Are you going to just pass that local act?
I'm not going to pass it in my district.
That's right.
No.
So, again, I don't think this thing would ever fly.
A comment about it
Yeah.
from when we were going through Lost. We said, I really said to our county manager, what other options do we have? And the answer was host. We said, oh, what do we know about host? Bring Clint in and let's talk and see what the host looks like to be able to do that, and invite everybody that wants to come in and listen to the presentation on what host looks like. So it was eye-opening for all of us. It was, okay, thank you.
Sounds good in theory, but in practice, that looks pretty tough.
We like the idea of all the homestead exemptions not having to pay, but what it takes to get through it, we can't get there from here.
So I'll briefly touch on most, because that also came up at the first meeting. I think most came up in the context of, okay, if counties are going to have this host threat on the table, give us a most threat, basically. So if they can go to a host, we can go to a most, I think was kind of how it came up. Well, one of the big differences I've already mentioned, with host, you got to get your delegation on board to do it. With most, you don't have to get your delegation on board. If you all were to change general law to allow all cities to do a most, the cities could put it to referendum without going through the delegation. So that's an issue. Also, remember the current most is used just for water and sewer. If you're going to start using it for operational, so it could replace like a lost tax, you'd have to go ahead and write a whole new law for that because the current one's only for capital. You'd have to use it for operational purposes. Yes?
What about like public safety? Would that fall under operational as far as use?
Well, there's capital and operational components to it. Obviously, paying your police officers, that's operational. Buying patrol cars, or building a building, that's capital. But most is very narrow right now. Not only is it only for capital, but it's for a very specific kind of capital. It's for water and sewer infrastructure. So you can't use it for patrol cars even, or fire trucks, or any of that stuff. So you all would have to go in and completely create a new type of most statute. And then you'd have to, if you want it for operations so it could do what Lost is doing, you'd have to design it so it would almost be probably a permanent type of tax used for operations, used to roll back city property taxes or however you want to structure it. And then you all had some of these discussions at the first meeting, but our concern with most is one, every other local sales tax is a shared sales tax. Counties and cities share it, and it's countywide. You get into a tax just for the cities, now the unincorporated areas, they're going to want a tax just for them, right? Or the county's going to want a tax just for them. Take water and sewer, for example. We've got some counties that have big water sewer systems in the unincorporated area. And they're going to say, well, if you expand even the current most to all cities, to allow all cities to do water and sewer, they're going to be like, what about me? In my county, we have a countywide water authority. Where can I get money like them to offset my costs for my water authority or my county water system? And it's like, where's the equity there? Okay, if we're going to give another sales tax for water and sewer to some cities, then give it to everybody that's got water and sewer, regardless of who's providing it, right? If that's the policy, you determine that sales tax is a good offset for keeping water rates down. If that's your policy and you want to provide more sales tax to do that, then apply it to everybody that has a water system, not just cities that have water systems. Yes?
The issue, though, isn't it about the negotiations for Lost and how most and host are just cards that are played
Yes.
in those negotiations
Yes.
rather than them being actual viable options for counties or for cities.
Yes.
And so if the issue is about how do we make the negotiations for Lost more sustainable, less adversarial, more equitable, more data-driven, what have you, then what most and host actually are a little bit irrelevant because it's just the ability to play those cards.
Right.
On the negotiation table.
Yeah, and you all, through a change to the law, obviously, this is your committee to make recommendations, but you can even take away the threat, even though we don't think it's a credible threat, and just say, you can't do it, right? You can't eliminate a Lost and go to a host or a most or whatever. That's for y'all to decide. But yes, we're talking about Lost today, and that's the context we're talking about. Both most and host is sort of alternatives to Lost and cards that you play in the negotiation, and are they fair cards to play? So, the most important part, what are the solutions? I'm going to go back to the question I asked you all at the very beginning. You got to kind of decide as a committee, do we try to improve this process that we just went through, or do we throw it out and go back to some kind of a formula? So if you're trying to improve the process, GMA and HG have already been working on that. And I'll tell you where we're at on that. We don't have a final agreement yet. So what I'm telling you today, I just want to preface it by saying this is just the discussions that are happening amongst staff and a few of our elected officials. Our policy councils have not signed off on any of this. But what we're talking about right now is marrying up Lost and SDS negotiations that happen in the same calendar year following the year you do your comprehensive plan. Why? Because we just talked about all the things in Lost that have to do with service delivery and all the things in SDS that have to do the same thing. So get the same elected officials together at the same time to do both of those negotiations, because there's a lot of cross-discussion that takes place. Versus what happens now, where one group of elected officials handled the SDS negotiations 8 years ago, and now you got a whole new group of elected officials that wasn't there 8 years ago, and now they're handling Lost negotiations. And they don't really know what that group did 8 years ago. And so it gets real confusing. So do it all within the same year, both SDS and Lost. Still two separate negotiations, and you still have to sign two different agreements, but you do it all in the same calendar year. So that's, yes.
I just want to ask one question, because I'm kind of I'm an ag guy, right?
Right.
And it's kind of been sticking to me a little bit. I just want to ask, but if you're saying what counties saw a 22% decrease
Yes.
and cities was 49%?
And those are just averages,
Yeah,
yes.
so if you had a rural county that was in a loss and went to a host, I mean, farmers could see their taxes go up.
Yeah, you go 0% reduction with a host, right? Because you don't get a host.
Right,
Yeah.
but still, you have to run county government and you have to
That's right.
educate your children, so
Yes.
they could see their taxes go up 30 or 40%. Am I understanding that correctly?
Without a loss, well, on average, we said it was roughly 22% off your tax bill. So if that loss went away, you lose about that 22% reduction. Again, it's different from county to county. But yeah, your taxes would go up roughly 22%.
Okay, so if you went from a loss to a host.
Or if you just lost and didn't go to anything. But yeah, either way, because you don't get the host on those types of properties. So even if you went to a host, the government would still get a replacement source for loss, but you as a farmer wouldn't get a reduction on your ag property tax bill. You'd get a reduction on the house you live in, but it probably wouldn't be. My guess is your farm costs a whole lot more than the house you live in. I'm just guessing, but
It does.
yeah. So
Yeah, I don't get it.
aligning SDS and lost is one of the things we're looking at. The other thing we're looking at is simplifying the 8 criteria that I went through and making it easier to understand. So going from about 8 criteria to probably about 4 criteria and trying to improve on. But there would still be criteria to consider, and there would still probably be fights over the 4 criteria. But at least it'd be better than maybe the 8. And then the last thing that we're looking at is a dispute resolution process. So if the county and the cities failed to renegotiate, you would bring in an outside panel to provide a recommendation. So they would not be deciding it, but they would be providing a recommendation on how to decide it. So the outside panel would hear from both sides. So both sides would exchange all their information, give each other their best and final offer, put it all your cards on the table, right? Here's what it is. And then if they still couldn't reach a consensus, they take all the information they've already disclosed and turn it over to the panel. Now, they can't bring in any new information to the panel. Like, you can't hold sort of something in your back pocket and pull it out at the last minute and say, oh, and by the way, this is on the table too. No, you can only present to the panel what's already been disclosed. And then the panel looks at both sides and they decide which proposal is the most reasonable and makes the most sense and is best justified based on the data and everything else that's used. And they pick one and say, this is what we recommend you do. And then the elected officials can either accept it or not. Those that accept it, though, don't lose any sales tax and continue to get what they've always received. Now, that you don't have a new distribution certificate in place, so you're not going to get the new percentage, whatever that may be one day, but you continue to get what you've always gotten. The side that does not go with the recommendation and says, we're not doing it, they're going to start losing some of their sales tax. Not all of it, but some of it. And the DOR is going to hold it in an escrow account until they reach an agreement, and that ratchets up over time. So it's putting a lot of pressure on the side that doesn't agree to the recommendation to come back to the table and figure it out is what it does. Again, some of our members like that, some of us don't, but it is a process for resolving the dispute versus the process right now for resolving the dispute is everybody loses, the tax is gone, right? This keeps the tax from going away from everybody. And it tries to reward the better, whatever the dispute panel thinks is the more reasonable body, they get kind of rewarded because their side gets chosen and they continue to collect the tax they've always collected. And the side that's being unreasonable in the view of the dispute panel, they now got to acquiesce and agree to it or start facing penalties. Also gives them some political cover, right? Because if they're the side that doesn't get their agreement chosen by the dispute panel, then they can say, well, we had to go with the dispute panel because we can't afford to lose any of this money, but it was a dispute panel that kind of pressured us into doing this. But the dispute panel would be made up of a county official, a city official that have both gone through training. The training would be put on by GMA, ACCG, and probably the Carl Vinson Institute of Government. So we would train you can't be a panel member unless you've gone through the training. And then we'd have one neutral that would be somebody that's part of Jim, what's the word for the neutral? They're part of a judicial mediator arbitration. The Supreme Court has a list of, so they don't really understand county and city government, but they do understand mediation and arbitration, and they would also be on the panel. So that's what we're looking at. So that's an attempt to improve the existing process, but it's still it's still going to be a negotiation, right? You're not getting rid of the negotiation if you go down this road. The other way to handle it would be to go to a formula. So these last three solutions all are formulas, and they all are formulas with they're simple formulas. They're easy to calculate, and they've got the taxpayer in mind. So we're not really thinking about these formulas from the perspective of what does the county get, what does the city get, it's what do the taxpayers get. So the first formula would just go back to the original formula, reinstate the original formula. Now remember, the original formula got thrown out because it was unconstitutional. So if we go back to the original formula, we can make it legal, we just got to go into the Constitution to make it legal. So that's the big hurdle with the original formula. We would actually have to go in and have a statewide referendum, 2/3 majority passage in the House and the Senate, to get it on the ballot, and then pass it statewide to go back to the original formula. But that is an option, right? Go back to the original formula, make it constitutional. And then it's a simple population divide.
Before you,
Yes.
With this panel that you're talking about, Stuart, can you weigh in on
The
what that
legality
may look
of the
like
panel?
and
Yes.
provide some clarity? I got you right here, Stuart.
Thank you. You knew what I was concerned about.
I know where he's going because we've had these conversations, but go ahead, Stuart.
So what happened with the arbitration panels was at least the rationale that the Supreme Court relied on when they threw out the amendment made in, I think, 2010?
Yes.
Their concern there was that in that case, it was a Superior Court judge who was going to make the final decision on what the tax rate should be, what the distribution formula should be. And the Supreme Court felt that that was a legislative function. And the state constitution, at least at the state level, provides for a strict separation of powers. So the Supreme Court thought that leaving it up to a Superior Court judge to be the final arbiter on the distribution formula required that judge to make a bunch of policy calls, and that was a legislative function, and therefore that's why the baseball arbitration provision was thrown out. I think arguments were also made in the lower court that you're taking some of the constitutional powers that the governing authorities of cities and counties have away from them as well. But that's not something the Supreme Court ruled on in that case, but there is that kind of issue floating around out there as well, as taking what is constitutionally given to the boards of commissioners or city councils and giving that to another body that has not been created by the Constitution could also, be problematic. So that's kind of why it's difficult to formulate, a solution. Is you got to find somebody who's not a Superior Court judge, and still keep a lot of discretion in the hands probably of the city and county governing authorities on them having the final say, I guess, on what goes forward.
Yeah. So we have no idea, and if you all were to put this dispute process in law, I guarantee it would get challenged, and the courts would have to rule on this and tell us if this dispute process is constitutional or not. The attempt to make this dispute process constitutional is two things. One, we take it out of the Superior Court judge's hands and we put it in the hands of a panel that is made up of some county and city elected officials, even though they're not from that jurisdiction. And then the second thing we did to try to make it constitutional is to make it a non-binding arbitration. So they issue a decision like arbitration, but that decision is not binding. The county and city officials still have to make the decision whether they adopt the decision of the panel or not. But that being said, it is somewhat coercive, right? Because if you don't adopt it, there's going to be some incentives for you to adopt it, right? And penalties if you don't adopt it. So the carrot or stick approach. And so I guess that would be the question for the courts. If the dispute process, if you all were to put this dispute process in law, it's going to get challenged, and the courts are going to have to say, well, is it really still in the discretion of the county and city governing authorities to make this decision, or have you made it so coercive that they really have no choice but to adopt it because they can't afford to lose the money? Or that's going to be the kind of the conversation I think you're going to have in the courts over this, and we don't know what the answer to that is. But again, I'm just telling you what we're talking about. This is our attempt to try to make what was clearly unconstitutional in the former baseball arbitration, to try to make it constitutional. Now, the other way to do it, and Jim and I have talked about this too, is again, open up the Constitution and put it in the Constitution. Then you can make it binding arbitration if you put it in the Constitution. But that would be another big hurdle to get over to try to put something like that in the Constitution. So I mentioned the original formula. The third one is a formula that would just give everybody the same percentage off their tax bill. I've got some slides on that. That's the original formula. This is a sort of give everybody the same percentage off their tax bills. This is an example. So what you see over here, that column there is how they're currently splitting the loss. So the county's getting 82% of it, and City A gets 14%, and you see on down the list. But to make it to actually give everybody 26% off their bill, because right now, unincorporated residents and city residents are getting 23% off their county bill, 23.52. City A gives their residents 33% off, City B gives them 62% off, City C gives them 87% off, and City D gives them 77% off. And those are probably the smaller cities, obviously. So you can see that depending on where you live, you get a different amount of tax relief. But if you want to give everybody 26% off their total tax bill, that's the county and the city bill combined. So if you live inside the city, it's the combination of the two. Then you're going to have to readjust the numbers. But there's a way to do that. You all could legislatively say, we're just going to give everybody the same percent off your bill. We don't care if you live in unincorporated area or in city A, B, C, or D. But that would be a significant change in revenue between counties and cities if you were to go that route. And I guarantee everybody would run their numbers, and the people that are going to lose money are not going to like that formula. And then the last one I'll throw out there would be the HDRG grant formula that you're already using, right? You used it this year. The reason this one's different is it's not a percentage off the bill. It's a flat dollar amount off your bill. Remember, the governor said, I'm going to give everybody $500 off their property tax bill. Well, $500 off my $200,000 property is going to be a much higher percentage than $500 off my $1 million property, right? But in the eyes of equity, some people may think that's fair, right? Okay, we don't really care what your property's valued at. We're just going to give everybody the same dollar amount off. And the way HDRG is calculated, remember, it's $18,000 worth of value. That's what HDRG was done this year. You could set it at any number, but this year was $18,000 of value times the millage rates, county, city, and school millage rates, to get you that roughly $500. But if you look at your own bill, you'll see that your HDRG grant is not $500. It's something close. It's either below that. I think mine was $440. Some people probably it's over $500. It depends on your millage rates. The higher your millage rates are, the more HDRG grant credit you're going to get dollar-wise. But it's still going to be roughly close to the same amount for everybody. But you remember, that was the Ways and Means chairman wanted to do this statewide. Now, I'm not suggesting we do this statewide, because then you'd have to suck all the money up into a state pot. But you could at least do it at the county level. So within a particular county, you could take the sales tax that comes from that county and share it with all the taxpayers based on the HDRG grant formula that the General Assembly's already created. So all these things I'm talking about are things that are currently in law. This is not plowing new ground. These are things that already exist. We're just saying maybe you could use one of the things that already exist that you're already doing as a way of splitting lost. And by the way, ACCG doesn't support any of those formulas I mentioned. I haven't run any of that by my policy council. What I'm trying to do is give the committee thinking through, do you all want us to improve the process or try to come to some agreement on a formula? But we can't do both. And so I would hope between, say, now and your next meeting in Spalding County, we could get some feedback. When I say we, me and Jim Thornton from GMA, we could get some feedback from you all, because we're going to have our subcommittee get together again before the Spalding County meeting. But which way do you want us to go? Do you want us to keep going down the road we're going down, which is just make the current process better? Or do you really want us to take a stab at creating some kind of a formula that we can get consensus on? I'll be upfront with you. Us getting consensus on a formula, at least in Jim's eyes and my eyes, is near to impossible. Like, we think we're going to win, we probably can win the lottery if we can do that. But we will try. But at the end of the day, it's going to be tough, because our members look at it not from necessarily what's equitable from the taxpayer's point of view. They look at it from what's equitable for me as a county government or city government. And nobody wants to lose money in their budget, right? So any formula we throw out there, every county and city is going to run the numbers, and they're going to make the decision about how they feel about it based on how it affects them personally. And that's the problem with the formula. Y'all have any questions? We've got some other presenters I want to bring up to talk about their local situations and how they dealt with loss negotiations at their local level. But that's the general presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Sure, go ahead.
So, agree with your assessments. I have one question about the first recommendation, or the improving the process
Yes.
recommendation, and tying it more closely to the service delivery strategy. And I have a concern, and I'm just registering the concern.
Sure.
Is, I think in Chatham County, where we had what I would describe as an exciting loss negotiation, our service delivery process was not exciting. It was driven by data, it was driven by service, it was staff-led. When it got to, the manager level and then the commission and the city council level, very easy to approve those because we had those, kind of politics taken out of that process, and it was based on service delivery and what was the best strategy for us to serve our residents jointly as county governments. And so just registering the concern that the closer we tie that process in with a political process, we're going to seep in some of that gamesmanship, perhaps.
In both.
In both.
Well, one of the reasons, again, 2 separate negotiations just done in the same calendar year. You could do one negotiation, finish it, and then do the other. So do one for 6 months, do the other. You could do them both simultaneously. That's up to you all. But one of the things that not only do you have the same elected officials negotiating on both agreements, but we do envision there to be some trade-offs. We do envision that maybe there's a double taxation issue that comes up in SCS, or a service. We no longer want to provide this service in the county. Let's give it to the city, or vice versa. Let's take a city service and let the county do it countywide. But there could be some trade-off in revenues, because SDS is about the cost side of your budget, right? The expenditure side of your budget, where loss is more about the revenue side of your budget. So if you do both of them sort of in the same year, you could get into some of those negotiations and trade-off. Okay, I'll help fix some things over here in SDS, but you need to give me a little more money on Lost. And you can have that conversation if you're doing them in the same calendar year. If you're doing them, say, 8 years apart, that conversation is probably not going to happen. Or if it did happen, it's going to be forgotten, and you got a different set of players in the room. It's going to make it really hard. So yeah, we understand that doing both negotiations in the same year could be problematic for some people, but we feel like again, the benefits outweigh the cons in getting them both done, and then not having to worry about either one of them for 10 years. So you get them knocked out, and you're good for another 10 years, and then you do them again.
Well, we did ours in the same year. They just weren't tied together necessarily.
So that's what we're suggesting. Then you did it exactly. We're not suggesting you do them in a single negotiation. It's still 2 separate negotiations, and you can handle those negotiations however you want. So, because you still have to sign 2 different agreements. The SDS agreement goes to DCA, as you know. The loss certificate goes to Department of Revenue. And there's thresholds that are different for who signs for the cities, right? You got to have the county sign on for both. But with SDS, there's a different threshold of the cities that have to sign on than loss, right? And so we're not changing any of those thresholds. You would still have to have the required number of city signatures that the law requires for both. Any other questions for me? We appreciate the time you've given us. I'm going to go ahead now. Let's see, who is first? Byron? Yes.
Do any members of the committee need to pause for
Break.
3 minutes?
I'm good.
So Byron, if you'll come on up. Byron's from Greene County. Byron's the county manager for Greene County. If you don't know anything about Greene County, how many of y'all, raise your hands, you've been to Reynolds Plantation? Been to the Ritz? That's his county. So obviously he's got kind of a wealthy enclave there around the lake in his county, which is good for his tax base. But it probably gave him a little more money to fight over, too, in their loss negotiations. So I'm going to let Byron kind of talk a little bit about his experience with their loss negotiations. Thanks, Byron.
Thank you, Clint. Thanks to the committee for letting me get up here and speak about Greene County. I've been there for over 22 years as the manager now. So I actually started working there in May of 1997, not as manager, but then became manager. And so this most recent loss negotiations was my 3rd bite at the apple. So I've been through 3. Any horror story that you have heard, they're real. I can assure you of that. Trying to learn through each of the 2 former experiences, I approached this one a little differently. I wanted to put purely analytical data, verifiable, accurate data, And so I probably prepared for close to a year leading up to it. None of the cities were. I've got 5 cities in the county. None of them were preparing. I was using the data and crunching the data based on GeoMa's perspective and ACCG's perspective. I wasn't trying to bias it towards counties. I was trying to get all the data so that everybody, when we sat down, we steered away from the emotion. That was my goal, was to steer away from the emotion. I gave a 28-page report to all 5 cities ahead of the first meeting in January of 22. And then we sat down and went through it in the first meeting. Gave the lost history, some of the same stuff that Clint and Dante went through, the history, the local history of collections. Really thought it was a very thorough presentation. Then I acknowledged, however, that it was still my product. So I begged them. I mean, I must have said it 10 times during that first meeting, pleading with them, go attack this data. Go attack it, come back with your own data. And we had set the next meeting for a month out. So they come back, bring whatever data you can compile. Let's add it to the matrix. Let's discuss it. Let's figure out whether it's applicable. Let's figure out if something's wrong with my data or not. So 30 days goes past. We show up for the second meeting. All 5 cities show up. Not one single one brought any data in. And they acknowledged that they couldn't attack the data. The data was accurate. There was nothing they could do. The data actually showed that Greene County should go from a 68% to conservatively 85% of lost. Now, bear in mind, we're sort of an anomaly. Over 93% of our tax base is unincorporated. Less than 7% is in the 5 cities, all combined. So our data was going to show a much heavier weighting towards the county. We certainly didn't expect to get 85%. But we didn't want to negotiate against ourselves or negotiate from an emotional perspective. But that's exactly where it went. And whenever you get that level of emotion and the zero-sum game that you actually are in, it's going to create a lot of hurt feelings, a lot of hurt relationships. And so if there's one thing that I could, hope for out of this committee's efforts is some way to not have that. I would certainly prefer not to have the negotiations at all. Been through 3. I won't make the next one. I'll retire first. But the staff members that will likely come in behind me have said, no, you're going to have to come back and help us. It's preparing that much data is pretty daunting. And not all the staff members, particularly in my county, we are a small rural county. Even though we have Lake Oconee, we're still small and rural, so we don't have very deep staff. So they know that when it comes up again, they're going to need some help. For whether or not I actually help in the next one, who knows? But I think it was the thing that made it more difficult for me every time we deal with this is you're dealing with new electeds, whether it's on the county side or the city side, or most likely both. Of the 5 cities we have in Greene County, 3 of the cities have have fewer than 264 people in the city, but yet they still want a seat at the table. And in their eyes, they're still a city, and legally, yes, they are still a city, but less than 264 people, and of those 3, none of them have a property tax. So they are getting that 100% reduction. There is a data-driven formula that can be derived and take all of that negotiation out of it so that you're not fighting in such a small town where, in my case, I'm the one that wore the bullseye because I was the one carrying the water. The electeds, great. I've got some great ones. We've got some great ones with the cities. But do they understand everything they need to know about service delivery strategy or services or lost or how it works or how to calculate a rollback? They don't. And so they rely on staff. So then the staff members, the hired employees, are the ones that end up getting, sort of beat up in the process. And in some cases, it can lead to their departure because it gets that ugly. It is that ugly of a process, and it's crazy not to try to fix it. when you have a city consultant, after we went through more and more meetings all throughout the year trying to get an agreement, it's that one of the cities, the county seat, finally hired a consultant. That consultant came in and put together a bunch of data. I knew him. His data was incorrect. I mean, just mathematically incorrect in many cases. But he had also represented some counties. So here you've got a law statute that can be argued so fundamentally different by the same consultant depending on whether he's representing a county or representing a city. That should tell you all something. That should tell you something. I mean, fundamentally different perspectives. I mean, complete paradoxical argument if I'm on the city side as to when I was on the county side. And we actually used that in our discussions. Hated to attack the credibility of somebody I knew, but I had to. Why would you argue this for these cities, but over here you argued the opposite for these counties that you represented? So it is that also cost that city money they didn't have, about $15,000 or $18,000, whatever they paid them. They didn't have that money. And our three smaller cities, they don't have staff, so they don't have the ability to compile this data or go hire a consultant. But in the end, the county seat didn't want to discount the smaller cities because the more of them that were at the table, the more they were a unified front battling against the mean old county. And that's the other thing. The one thing that helped us get through this in our case, we did go from 68 up to 82, ramping up over 5 years, which is pretty remarkable for us. But the one thing that helped us is as I dealt with each county commissioner, I asked them, just please be resolute. Don't get picked off by this city or that city. They all have their little alliances and they're close with this city where they live or it's in their commission district. Don't let the city council members pick you off and plead with you from an emotional perspective and tell you how much it's going to hurt the city. Let's stick to the numbers. Let's stick to the data. And for the first time in 22 plus years, they did it. The commissioners did it. They stuck together. We did have to leverage the host to some extent. Clint and I had those discussions over the phone. It was not something we wanted to do. I think our commissioners, though, one of the things that they were resolute on is they were not going to accept a formula that was so inequitable that they were actually willing to let it go and try the host. We did run a lot of numbers for a lot of our historical legacy farmers, our agricultural community, which is still strong in Greene County, and we could show them a lot of their farm property was in conservation use. It wasn't going to hurt them that much. In fact, their homes and their surrounding acreage that they did have homesteaded, many of them, the majority of them, were going to be better off under the homestead option sales tax. From our citizens' standpoint, we would have rolled back our property tax 100% on homesteaded properties. So to talk about whether or not it would pass, more than likely it would pass. You know, we were already in the community explaining it, not because we wanted to do it. We really didn't want to do it. It was not something we wanted. We certainly didn't want to take that revenue away from the cities. But we also didn't want an inequitable formula that we had to stick with for 10 years. So in the meetings that we had with people in the community groups, and explaining it, overwhelmingly, they were in support of the host, even knowing that there was going to be this gap. We had ways we were going to overcome that gap. So we did have a way to try to make it work. But at the end of the day, it was such an inequitable result from a failed negotiation that the commissioners were not willing to do it. And they stuck with it unanimously. They were resolute. And so we finally got to where we needed to be. The damage done in that process, though, the relationships that get damaged are unbelievable. And you either got to wait until the next negotiation, or you got to wait until electeds change, or managers change, or staffs change. That's not healthy for a small community. It's not healthy for a large community. So we definitely need to have a change. Hopefully you guys will come up with a great solution for that. And with that, I'll answer any questions anybody may have. Yes, sir.
What changed in your county that it would go from, would you say 67% to 85% by data? Was that changes in the county, or are you saying that was poor negotiations in years past?
So mostly it was a failed or a poor negotiation 10 years ago, and I was a part of that. The longer you stay, maybe a little more credibility you get. So back then, the chairman that we had, great guy, salt of the earth guy, but wanted everybody to get along, wanted everybody to hold hands and be nice. So we did not land where we needed to land in the 2012 negotiations. So we really needed to make up some room. But again, if you think about our tax base, 93% is unincorporated. Our business district is not inside the city. The hard part about that, though, is the cities wouldn't acknowledge that. But with the Ritz-Carlton and how much money it generates, Lake Oconee Village with the Publix and all of the merchant shops around it, our business district is not inside any of our cities. So we are an anomaly to an extent. But because of any of the analytical data you use, all based on the 8 criteria, some of the criteria were not necessarily applicable. But to the extent that we could compile data on all 8 criteria, we did. And again, it was all verifiable, accurate data. It showed that in some cases we should be 92 or 98%. I put a chart together that aggregated all of the different data sets that were relevant to the 8 criteria and weighted them all the same and came up with 85.22%.
If you had it to do over again with the relationships that were damaged, would you do it all over again the same way?
I would. There's no way around it. Again, 3 times, all 3 times you had the damaged relationships. It didn't matter what approach I used. I can sit there at the end of the day and know that our data was right. The cities acknowledged our data was right. And that's who I am. I am data driven. I am, financially driven. So if I can show it and if people don't like it, I'm okay with that. I don't have to get elected. The electeds might want to do it different, but I don't think they would. I think they're happy with where we landed. Yes, sir.
Really admire the approach that you've taken. What pieces of verifiable?
Let me interject 1 second, Mr. Manager. Could you pull the microphone closer to you?
Yes.
Our awesome press team, they're streaming
Got
this.
it. Great. Just a lot of respect for the approach you took on your negotiations. What were the pieces of data that you felt, if you could give an example of the verifiable data that you used in your report?
Yeah, so the largest one was, of course, the property tax base. So we have 9 special districts in the county that we're able to dissect the data for those 9 districts. They're fire districts. We have a recreation special district. We have a library special district. Those are countywide. We have a few others, but being able to look at that data and show that, for example, around Reynolds, 65% of our tax base is in that tiny little area. I mean, it's less than 1/10 of the county, geographically speaking, but yet it represents 65% of the tax base. When you then add to that the neighboring fire district, which is the low rent side of the lake where I live, you're adding another 15%. So 2 fire districts, less than 20% of the geographic area of the county is 80% of the tax base. The cities can't fathom that because they're always used to historically being that's where all the commerce took place. They can't fathom that, and they're disconnected with that. That data was helpful, but for purposes of loss, just the unincorporated versus the incorporated tax base was one of the huge metrics. Obviously, population is a huge metric. I calculated it based on GeoMa's preferred method, but also calculated it based on, obviously, what we would prefer to use to get credit for the entire county. And I had both data sets in there and used them both in the aggregated data, just trying to be fair. Beyond that, in terms of sales tax, we can't guess. I didn't want to use any numbers that we couldn't guess on. We know from our hotel motel tax and what comes in through the Ritz-Carlton, we had a good idea of how much sales tax is generated just from the Ritz-Carlton. That morphs the sales tax collected in the rest of the county. It really does. So we showed those numbers, showed that data, but we didn't rely on that data because it wasn't verifiable. So even though we had some information in the package, we didn't put that in aggregated data because we couldn't prove it. Trying to think of the others, I know that the property tax was the biggest and the population was probably the second biggest.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions?
Just a question as it relates to, you have a large unincorporated area that remains unincorporated that you provide your services to.
Yes, sir.
All right. And your cities have a much smaller share of what is incorporated. I guess my question would be, what happens when annexation comes into play and those cities start growing or annexing into the unincorporated areas? I mean, would that change, or would it be the way it is in Greene County for the foreseeable future?
So if I understand the question, I mean, obviously, the county seat is growing. The other 4 cities have not done any annexation other than one little small part on one city in 20 years. Greensboro does continue to grow. We encourage them to grow. We encourage Greensboro to be healthy. If Greensboro is healthy, it helps us. As they grow, then as their population grows or as their tax base grows, obviously that would change those data sets in 10 years. And we would have to factor that in. I'm certainly would not be hypocritical and include it now and then not include it in 10 years if I'm involved at all. But it'll help them, and we encourage them to try to have good, healthy growth, quality growth, because it will certainly help them with their sales tax percentages in the future.
I think last question would be, you put together a great data set, and one thing that I know members of this committee that serve in the General Assembly, when we come back the second Monday in January, it's 40 days, and it's a gauntlet to get through a lot of bills in 40 days, and sine die, sometimes you're reading a blurb and voting. Would there be any help to have some periodic review periods within that 10-year period to bring both governments together to discuss growth and changes that may be occurring to help prepare for that next 10-year negotiation? So it's not, we're cramming 10 years of change in a small subset of a window from July, got to get it done by 12/31 or it goes away, because information does take time to digest. I mean, just look at the General Assembly, it takes us 2 years.
Yep. So it would be helpful. I think, knowledge is key. Education, being informed is key. And so I wouldn't want to, again, I would favor a formula in statute so there are no negotiations. So, we said that up front. But if you are going to have to negotiate, then periodic reviews to just talk about the status, not negotiate, but just the status to try to educate. Only downside to that is some of those electeds that are there on those periodic reviews may not be there in 2032 when it comes up again. So you may have lost some traction, but it would be helpful. Again, I mentioned that the electeds have a lot to learn. They're certainly sipping from a fire hose, and there's no way that they can know everything they need to know in that time when lost hit. So any upfront, I beg my commissioners when they go to ACCG's conferences to take this class or that class. I'm not sure they do. But we need to do a better job, I think, ACCG and GOMA, in making sure their electeds fully understand this stuff.
Well, maybe it's not at the elected level, but maybe it's a staff review. The staff in government tend to outpace most of us. I'm looking at Stuart. I'm like, Stuart, did you write any of this into laws? And the reason for that is maybe it's a periodic staff review, because staff has the ability to influence elected officials. Because if Stuart tells me this isn't going to fly, then it's not going to be, a bill that I think any one of us carry. And so would that be something that, staff is consistent, like you've been here, to have these reviews, and so that, maybe if you do have a new city manager or a new county manager, you all have had a chance to go through this review process together and better understand and look at the record per se, and then advise your respective elected bodies to kind of move forward. So that way they understand that, this is, the recommendation from staff. This is what we've been meeting to understand and do, and here's how things are changing and how we can kind of get to that compromise in preparation for the next, 10-year loss negotiation. I would love to see a formula possibly as well, but like any good thing in statute, somebody will come to Stewart and, there'll be a carve out of, the formula, and then it, doesn't work because we've just carved it out so much.
It would be healthy. I mean, what you're speaking of would be healthy, and I'm sure that already occurs organically in some places anyway. For our part, it does not. I mean, we actually tried to have meetings with all the mayors on a monthly basis, and it was just a same thing as the loss negotiating was. It's always a handout, can you do this for me? Can you do that for me? And so our chairman said, that's not what we're here for. We're here to talk about and collaborate on things, not just you come in here with your list of things you want us to do for you. So those meetings fell apart. But at the staff level, some of it does already occur, and I'm sure in other jurisdictions it occurs a lot more frequently than it does in Greene County, but it does occur to some level now. No others? All right. Thank you.
John Hart, the attorney here in Chatham County, so he's going to talk a little bit about the negotiations here.
And I do want to recognize, as John comes up, we do have our chairman of our county commission, Chairman Ellis, was here with us. He just stepped out. I missed him. We have Commissioner Pat Farrell and Commissioner Helen Stone, all representing Chatham County, that were here with us, and want to acknowledge them being a good politician. So as we talk about service delivery, just a shameless plug, Commissioner Farrell and that SSD is a pretty good subject about just getting rid of that, right?
Well, because of loss, because of the huge, financial inequity to that group of people, to find some solution, since there hasn't been one currently that the commission could affect.
There's no question that our way of having a general budget M&O and SSD complicates what you try to do in the negotiations. And I think Jay would agree with me that the negotiations were brisk at the very least. But I've been through 3 of these, and thus far we have been consistent about it being brisk. So, and we got 7 municipalities that have 7 sets of needs. They usually tie up to each other, go after the county share, and then divide everything that's left amongst themselves. Generally, I'd say on population, there may be some variances there, but that's kind of what you're seeing. We've got one particular town that's growing very rapidly, and therefore, obviously, the city of Savannah has to pace itself against that town. They want them to give up. It's the same old thing. Where's the money coming from? That's the bottom line. First of all, I commend you all for doing this, and I wish you all the luck in the world. I really do. I think you hit on something early on. Is that you're back to basics, the equitable property tax relief in a manner of dividing it so there won't be disparity between one jurisdiction and another jurisdiction over how much a citizen gets compared to another citizen. If you live in a municipality, you're going to get the county rollback. You're going to get the city rollback. If you live in the unincorporated county, you're going to get the county rollback. And that just in and of itself creates a disparity as between those. And then you get into the argument of what are we going to end up with in our share? And everybody has their own calculation for that. And I don't know how you get around that situation, because everybody becomes very myopic about how they look at that situation. And it's that zero-sum game. $1 taken away is $1 gained somewhere else. So that's what you're up against. The 8 criteria, to be polite, they're not very helpful. They're so vague, you don't know what you're doing. You know that first criteria that just went on for about 3 paragraphs? That got written partially by the city attorney, Jimmy Blackburn, who I had a great deal of respect for, putting the part in there about the city. And then the county attorney, who I know pretty well, wrote the part that dealt with the county. Well, when you got through reading that paragraph, you didn't know a damn thing about anything. And that's just the way it was, because everybody was protecting their nest. So I don't know how you overcome that. I think a formula, I think the 8 criteria either need to go away, or we need to have 3 criteria or 4 criteria that you can apply some type of an objective standard. Just like our manager from Greene County said, you know, you got to have numbers that you crunch that people can't come in and come up with something else. And in our situation, and I think it was true for the city, we'd come up with what we thought was a pretty good set of numbers, and they'd come in and see the same data sets in a different view text, and we'd get further apart rather than closer together. So those, and what do you do with them? You got to acknowledge them, because they say you got to acknowledge them, but as a practical, functional part of that thing, I have never in all 3 of them seen anybody sit down and really, when it gets down to how much am I getting and how much are you getting, they talk about any of those 8 factors. So if you can come up with 3 or 4 there, I would think that would go a long way. We got together before we came over here, the managers, myself, and a couple of others, and came up with some things that the county would like to see done, but I'm sure the city's going to hate it. But I'm hoping in there maybe is an idea that you can take and modify it however you wish. The biggest part, the county general fund carries so many services in it that nobody else pays for. And it's not getting better, it's getting worse. Because one of the best things that you can get out of the legislature is a new program that nobody funds. We'll let the county pay for that fee. Okay? And during our process, we came up with 32 different things that we did. And just to read off a few of it, the sheriff's department at $10 million, the county jail at $48 million, something as simple as the tax commissioner at $6 million, mosquito control at $4 million. That's like snow and ice money up north, you know. We don't have that problem. And then you go down and you deal with all the other issues, and that added up to $140 million. Well, actually $141 million. And if you went back and figured that again today, that would probably be 155, 156, somewhere in that lower range. I don't think it'd be quite at 160. But the thing about these 32 services is there's no revenue in them. Everything is an expense. So you don't have the water. The county does not provide water and sewer. That's provided through the city, and then there's a rate system that's worked out from underneath that. So I think that's what you see counties being up against. And then the other thing that there's been some discussion about that I think needs to be settled once and for all is there's a contingent of folks that believe the only thing the county deserves is those supplemental powers and nothing else. And there's been a couple of attorney general's letters and opinions indicating that the county should have the benefit of all the services they provide, not just the supplemental powers. Now, that might have been great 60 years ago, but supplemental powers is nothing compared to what you're on the other side of the ledger doing across the board for all these various things. You don't think much about a library, but you know, it's $7 million. You don't think much about the district attorney's office, it's at $9 million. If you have a district attorney's office, you got to have a public defender's office. So it keeps going on, and I don't know of any court that makes money. But you got all the judges, and you got all the deputy sheriffs in there. So that's the issue that you see in the larger cities and larger counties. And I'm sure the city could get up here and come up with 11 things that they felt, well, that's what we have to deal with. So my point to you is try to do something. Now, we came up with a couple of ideas, and Jay, if you don't roll your eyes, but someone wanted to take all the lost and just put it in the general fund and then do a countywide rollback, dollar for dollar. Now, that depends on whether your municipalities and your county is using all their money for ad valorem tax relief or whether they're using it to fund as revenue. And when you look yourself in the mirror, you got to answer that question, because there's really nothing inherently wrong with rolling back everything you make and lost among the various, and do it on population base. So that was one thought. Someone suggested putting all the money in the general fund and then chopping it in half, and the county gets 50% of that, and the city split up the other 50% based on their population. Now, if I was from the city, I don't know how I'd feel about that. And that number might change. It might be 60-40 or whatever. But that's the idea there. The final one we came up with was I Feel Your Pain. And that was somewhat similar to one of the suggestions made. And that was you need to start about 6 months out before the deadline drop dead date is. And you need to tell the cities and the counties, you got to come to agreement, guys. And oh, by the way, in order to incent you, if you don't have it in 90 days, then 10% of your lost funds are forfeited. If you don't have it in the next 60 days, another 10% is forfeited. And if you don't have something by the time we get to 30, you've lost 30% and you're very foolish. Now, that takes the charm out of all the game plan. And I found every one of the loss negotiations I've been involved in always came down that one person or group of persons felt they had such an unfair distribution that they would be willing to blow the whole thing up. And nobody wants that. But when you get down to a deadline, it seems like you do better. And so what I was thinking is if you did intermittent deadlines where everybody felt the pain in the same way, maybe they get serious a little bit earlier and we wouldn't be doing this at the end of the year. Or I think the last petition was filed within a few minutes of the deadline. So that's my advice. I think you got a good idea. I think what you got from the county government did a great job of laying out where the law was, what the issues are. Greene County had a very good presentation on things, but I've found they're not data driven. I've found that people get fixated on the percentages. And I could talk eyes blue in the face about these are actual out-of-pocket expenses for services nobody else is providing that we are. And you would get a look, because there wasn't any way to defeat that because the numbers were the numbers. But that was just ignored, and nobody really changed negotiating positions. Negotiating positions changed at the very last. And we ended up with a formula in which the county got an increase and we ramped it up over a period of years. And then we got into the argument over which ramp we're going to use, okay? County ramp or the city ramp. But eventually we got there. And I don't know of any easy way to do this other than doing it. But everyone I've been involved in, until there was some sense of urgency and reality to it that we're going to lose this, and oh my God, this will do what it'll do to our budget. And some of the little cities rely very heavily on it. We got one city that doesn't even have any local tax. So loss means everything to them. So I wish you guys all the luck in the world. And don't listen to anything Jay said. I'm just messing with you. No. I thought we had a brisk negotiations, but I don't think anybody ever got ugly about it. Now, behind the scenes, maybe people had hard feelings, but we've got too much going on in this community between the municipalities and the county that this is just one issue among many, and you got to move to the next issue. So anyway, thank you for your time. I think this is well worth it, and good luck.
Next, Heather Scott, who's the manager in Jeff Davis County, another one of our rural small counties. I think, John, you mentioned somebody turned it in like 3 or 4 minutes before the deadline. I think this is the person that turned it in.
Well, I actually was going to introduce myself as I am Heather Scott, the county manager in Jeff Davis County, and I was your last one to turn in the loss certificate on December 30th of 2022. And if I tell you that I still don't have nails for that reason, I do not. So just a little bit, just listening to the two before me. First let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have only been in Jeff Davis County for 4 years. I was the county clerk for 2 years, and actually this month has been 2 years for me as a county manager. This was my very first loss negotiation. And with that, when I tell you I studied and I read some more and I asked questions, and I thank ACCG for every bit of every call and probably aggravation I was to them. They were, if one couldn't answer the question, they led me to another one that could. But with that being said, the questions I asked, I had to go and take that to my board, and so that we could prepare the data that went along with what we had to get ready for. And yes, we were the last county to turn the certificate, but it wasn't because we didn't prepare. It wasn't because we didn't have ample time to get everything out there and the data out there and the mediations and the meetings and things like that with our cities, because there were times where we would schedule a meeting with the city and it wouldn't go through. Something would come up, or this would happen or that would happen. And when they talked about negotiations being ugly, they're ugly. They are. I can honestly say that, and this is, I will say, let me back up a little bit of, I'm not here to down cities. I think that we only have one city, and they are great. The people in the population are great people. But again, negotiations are ugly. Cities, they would come in and like counties, you want to have that income and that revenue to help your city. And that's what they're there for, as well as the counties are here for us to get that revenue to help our people in the county as well. But we give this data, and you go in there with the numbers of population, and when you get told that we're going to do this our way or no way, it takes it to another level, I guess, of negotiations. And I say that because we went in going population driven. We started out at 60-40, county 60, city 40. And so we put out that population. We're an estimated around 15,000, and the city being around 4. So we went in and said, look, if we can agree to it right now, we'll leave it the same. We were told no very quickly, and they wanted to reverse it to 70-30 city. With that being said, that was a no-go, and that ended that meeting very quickly. But we come back about 2 weeks later, and put out there with the SDS information, the services that are provided. And as they were talking earlier, the other two, you know, and also with Clint saying, you know, yes, there are services that the county provides that city gets to also, you know, use. Magistrate, EMS, EMA. We actually provide E911 for both city and county. We have a split fire, yes, but we provide rec departments, libraries, senior citizens. The county funds all of that, but the city benefits off of it as well. We put that out there, and it was a no-go very quickly. We then found that a formula had been presented to the city to use for their data. And again, we were the example for that. We were actually the county and the city that was used for that data. But the thing that come off of that was we weren't asked for our data. They were given from an SDS negotiation that had not been updated yet. So they were getting data, they were given data that was not all correct, so it looked like they were getting everything they needed, and it was in the better for the city, but not the better for the county. So we ended up in mediation, in which, again, because of not full-out education and understanding for both commissioners and city council, and I say this for both, because the education part of it needs to happen. It's got to happen. Education for both city and county. Because of that, at first, the city told they were very adamant that they did not want to go into mediation. Well, they didn't have a choice at that point. So because the 60 days were up, we had no choice but to go into mediation. Well, with that being said, mediation, we actually had our mediator come in, and after about 4 hours of mediation, because neither would budge, she said, I'm not going to waste taxpayer dollars and continue this because we're not going anywhere. The only thing that ended up helping us was having to lose, almost losing that tax for both the city and the county. And that's not, again, I tell you, negotiations is not, it is a horror story, especially for small counties, because hurt feelings are there, hurt relationships are there. And when I tell you that I don't think that our commissioners and councilmen, some of them spoke for, I know, months at the time after this. But they had to come together because, and honestly, I will tell you a big thing that helped is our local newspaper put out an article and told the good of what Lost is for both city and county. And I call it, I guess, keyboard warriors got on and and went in there and told both city and county that this is what you have to do to help both. But with also that being said, looking back of how things were done, it was more of who could help who more as far as themselves. And yes, that is how it needs to, you look to what help the city and the county, but you also make sure that, I try to go off database is what we tried to do, is what the county tried to do. And I know I'm jumping around a little bit on this because I don't want to kind of repeat everything that both of the other, but I will say that I am all for education of both. I feel as though that it should be a mandated training for both city and county officials and even not elected officials is because, and it should be the same training. And I say that great organizations. GMA is here to help municipalities and cities, and ACCGs are here to help counties, and that's what they're here for. And they work together wonderfully as well. But I feel as though they need to come together along with Carl Vinson and put together a mandated training that everybody has to go through, the same training, sitting in the same class, understanding the same information, because The information that I just got up from here, each and every one of you is going to take something different from that information. And you're going to take it home because you're going to find what works best for your county and your city, and you're going to take that first versus seeing the big picture of what all this information put out there. So I would recommend that for you all to look at is the mandated training, as well as if we are going to do a formula. I sit on a fence with a formula because, again, I feel as though the only way formulas would, work, the only way certain ones would want formulas is if it benefited them. But before I allow our county to really push to lose a tax, then that'd be the last, I apologize. That'd be the last thing we look at and have to use is a formula, because I would rather use a formula that helps at the end than to lose the tax completely, or to lose the lost completely. I apologize. But I also feel as though SDS negotiations should happen at the same time as loss negotiations, because where data that was given from our county from SDSs that had not been updated, it don't help when you're giving wrong data of things that weren't updated in the correct amount of time for that. You see what I'm saying? So I feel as though if we're going to, SDS negotiations and loss negotiations really need to work hand in hand with each other. Yes, again, they're two separate certificates. Yes, they should, they have to be signed, two different things, but they should be working hand in hand. But the biggest key, and I could say it over and over, the biggest key is education on this subject. And I feel as though it should be mandated with that. So that would be my recommendation. I appreciate you all listening to a little bit of our fun that we had with negotiations. But if y'all decide to take away negotiations, that'd be great. We wouldn't be mad about it. But again, it was an experience, and I hope, if Lord willing, He will let me be. We'll go through another one in 10 years. But I really pose that you all will look into that and look into the education part of it and look into the way that will make it easier for counties and cities to really work together to do this. Is there any questions?
Yes, I have one question for you. You talked about the newspaper putting out the pros and cons, and one of the things that I have observed in loss and the loss negotiations is they're done so without John and Jane Q. Public, and that the citizens don't have an opportunity to sit in and hear, and they're actually who hold all of us accountable, especially those of us that are elected. And anytime that they don't have the opportunity to understand, if you live in the city, you may have a perspective to the city. If you live in the county or unincorporated county, you may have that perspective. But also, the citizens have the ability to influence their commissioners and their city council people. But oftentimes, they quite don't know because they are not a part of those discussions. They just know that, hey, they put it out in the newspaper, if loss goes away, your county and city taxes are going to go up. And people are like, wait a minute, this is serious. Hey, hey. And that's where we get called, right?
Mm-hmm.
As our citizens say, hey, they're about to mess this up. I need you to go down and see what you can do because I can't, my taxes can't go up 40% or this much if they go away. Can you go down there and fix it? And I oftentimes, will tell my constituents, well, it's not really what we do. And then they remind me, but you're the senator, aren't you? You can go down there and fix it. And so I think all of my colleagues have the same experience, is that we get pulled into a lot of things, but yes, we do set and write the laws and pass them. But would that be something that would be helpful, is to have John and Jane Q. Public attend or have, those hearings discussed like you would the millage rate? You have to advertise and give the public the opportunity to come and provide feedback. Should loss be the same way, that if you're negotiating it at the county and city, that you open it so the public will have the opportunity to provide feedback?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, anytime the public can get involved, that's great. Now, as far as, I feel as though you should have a public hearing, but I also feel as though you should also have those meetings like we do as the negotiations, because there is pros and cons. Again, like you said, there are pros and cons when you bring the public in to do things. Yes, you are held accountable. But then what happens when, let's use Facebook for an example, and I call it keyboard warriors because they won't come to your meetings and they won't address, yes, they won't address you in public, but they will make sure that they put all of your dirty laundry out on the comments of anything that they're not happy with. I feel as though that if somebody is not happy, they're going to put it on these, social media sites, and they're not going to come to your meetings. And I feel as though they should have an opportunity to ask the questions and understand Lost, as well as I feel as though anybody else should be educated on. Because the thing with Lost is the first thing that most people do is say, well, SPLOST did this. No, there are two different things. And that's what people do not understand, is there are different things, and they work in different ways to help every community. But yes, I think public meetings and public hearings would be a great thing for this, but also still keep the negotiations so that you can work together as a council and with the board and both boards, but also give the public a little bit of letting them say, hey, well, y'all can't lose this. You can't go without this, because we're the ones who are going to suffer, and we're the ones who are going to not get the rollback, and we're the ones who are going to have to pay this, this, and this, and this. But I also want the public to also understand that commissioners and councilmen also have those taxes to pay. They also have, they're thinking that way as well. So they're thinking of themselves as well, as far as, yes, we can't lose this, but I also can't turn around and lose what they were asking for from us, is literally flip what happened. Because at the end of our day, all of this that we went through to the very last minute on December 30th of losing holidays and losing everything with family and things like that because they couldn't make a decision, guess where we ended up? 60-40 county and city. The exact same that they started with, that we could have just literally within 2 hours it'd been over. But here we are. So yes, I agree. I think there should be some public hearings along with it, yes.
And with all the economic development, one of the things that I'm mindful of, and I'm going to throw Department of Revenue not under the bus, but one of the things that they experience is that the state of Georgia, with all of the economic development and the growth that we're seeing, we're going to have a growth in collections. So your 60% and your 40%, if you collect more, is different, and it's a different dollar amount. So are we talking percentages or just real dollars? And I think that's something that I have asked Department of Revenue, and he's in the back. It slipped me, but it'll come back in 5 seconds, about so that, Joshua, so that we can talk about percentages and collections. Like, are we talking dollars or percents? Because counties are talking and cities are talking dollars, but we're putting them in percents because we're also banking that maybe collections do go up, or maybe they stay the same and flat. But one of the things that I know for certain we're seeing is an increase in collections. Because we have more tourism, we have more people visiting, more people paying the tax, population is growing, so more people are paying the 1 cent tax. So what's the Chatham County, City of Savannah metrics? Whatever the percents are that they agree to, the collections are going to be higher based off what they initially forecasted. And so my concern is with new dollars, and ACCG, maybe you all can answer this, when you agree to the formulary, it's not based on real dollars, it's based on a percentage, right? What happens when those dollars increase? Because then when you have a growth in your sales tax and your dollar figures go up, that's what becomes the fight, is that we had a growth in the collection of this, and this percent, while it may be a percent, it's the dollars we're talking about, that we've seen this increase in dollars, and if we go below this percent, we won't get this dollar amount that we're looking for. It's not the percent, it's the dollars.
So current law requires percentages. That's not us, that's the law says percentages. That's what we file with DOR, because that's very different when you look at real dollars. And we have counties where the sales tax is growing 10, 20% a year. We've got others where it's flat and maybe some where it's declining. So it's very different across our state. But, you know, I think theoretically, when the loss law was first created, the General Assembly wanted it to be a dollar for dollar offset. So every new dollar in sales tax you got should be a dollar you eliminate in property tax. So over time, as sales tax grows, I think the theory is your property tax should be coming down at the same rate. So if you get a 20% growth in your sales tax, and you apply that extra 20% growth or that extra dollar amount in sales tax, you're giving that dollar for dollar reduction in property tax. But as we know, in reality, that doesn't always happen.
Well, and that's my concern is I think each county and city could say we're actually probably not doing that. So what is the mechanism to kind of get us to that place where folks who live in counties and cities can see some type of rollback if collections exceed a certain threshold? What does that look like, or is that some kind of way to factor that in? Is that a formula? I don't know. I'm just putting it out for discussion amongst the committee because, you know, as taxpayers, for example, we live in Savannah, Chatham County, and I have constituents who call me about this little college, small private college that's happened to be in Savannah that's called the Savannah College of Art and Design, and they pay no property taxes. But they do have students, they do have folks. They do place a strain on infrastructure. They are in the city and they are absolutely in the county, but they don't pay necessarily a property tax. But what many of my constituents want to know is, well, we have to feel the burden of them not paying taxes. And they don't pay taxes on buildings because they're a nonprofit. And that is a question that has come up more and more. In fact, myself and Senator Dixon had this conversation about that as well. At some point, citizens who are taxpayers want us to find a medium to help them find some equity so that they're not feeling the brunt of that. And I don't know what that looks like. So maybe we can talk about that and answer that, and maybe that comes up in our next meeting. But I'm going to yield to the manager for the city of Savannah.
Well, I think that the question about like what comes first, the revenue or the rebate, is a really interesting one to pose. And then, you know, Clint, in your example, as Senator and I were just talking about your example, yes, in theory, the property taxes should come down if revenues are increasing, if the cost of those services remain the same as well. But as the counties attested to and as cities will attest to, the cost of delivering those services increases as well, and it gets back to everything being a zero-sum game, whatever that sum is. In Savannah, Chatham County, we're very fortunate. Our sales tax numbers are growing. It made it much more easy for the municipalities to grow the county share of the lost revenue this year because of that growth, and so we both see a benefit. But as you said, there are other counties that aren't experiencing that type of revenue growth, and that might not always be true for Savannah, Chatham County as well. So it's a really interesting question about, I'm thinking about my own budget formulation processes where admittedly we look at sales tax as a revenue, and this is part of our budget and not necessarily a rebate that's applied at the back end, like the governor's rebate that was just applied, right? Of course, it's calculated that way and shown that way on tax bills, and this is how much is offset, but it's a really interesting concept to think about what's coming first, the revenue or the rebate.
And I will say, looking at how small our county is, we do not have a lot of growth in our county. So the rollback, the biggest thing that I used with the commissioners of making sure we could do everything possible not to lose it. And I will say the host was discussed towards the end. It was never threatened to our city, but it was discussed, especially when it got to the point of, I think we got told that we would just lose it, actually. They would let it lapse. And so that's when our county started actually just discussing that amongst ourselves. But the rollback is a huge thing for us because our county has rolled back for over 15 years now and taxes have not been raised. So our county is actually you know, our people in our county are happy with that. They're happy that their taxes haven't gone up. Now, with that being said, that does hurt the county a little bit because you don't have that increase in your budget. So that does hurt us a little bit, but without the rollback, we would absolutely go up in millage at ridiculous amounts. And like like Clint was saying, people getting voted out, that is a very quick way for it to happen. Because it would end up putting us up at the 3 to 4 mills. And you can't, it's just not possible in certain aspects of it. So, especially in a small county like we live. So, with that, I know that you look at the dollar amount and the percentage, and yes, percentage helps, and we kind of, every budget that you look at, of course, is projected, and you never know if you're going to bring in all the revenue. You're praying that you're going to bring in all the revenue, but if something were to bottom out, you do what you can. But lost is a huge thing, especially for small counties like us, because it does make up for that additional revenue that is needed to help make sure that everything functions in a smooth way, and everything goes the way it needs to, because most of our county employees live right there in that county. There's not a lot that comes over and works from another county, and they depend on that and depend on that loss to help, not only keep their property taxes down, but also pay their bills every day. So I really hope that y'all look at ways to make this work and run smoother, and work for everybody in the best. So, any more questions?
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Stuart is going to help us draft some of the most amazing, awesome loss legislation of this decade. No pressure, Stuart. Do we have any other presenters? That's it. Well, I asked members of the committee to text me some meeting options that in the next 3 weeks would work. We want to build consensus. And, what the irony is, when you text me 3 dates, many of you will have the same date that you text me. And then I'm going to just, put out a scratch sheet of paper, write your name, all the dates, and then draw a circle around the ones that all align. I learned that in elementary school. So positive for public education there. But appreciate you all for coming today. Thank you to all of our presenters. And at our next hearing in Spalding County, there is a out-of-state presenter that has some ideology on loss. We'll hear from them. And we'll also have Senate research kind of give us what other communities are doing. Commissioner Farrell, you want to provide some commentary?
If you'd indulge me just a couple of minutes, I would love to share my perspective after going, as an elected county commissioner, going through 2 loss negotiations in my career here in Chatham.
Well, we are in Chatham County, Commissioner, so I will absolutely indulge if members of the committee are fine with that. I always want to check with the senators. Well, and would you use one of these mics? We're streaming it. And shout out to Todd Edwards from ACCG. I texted him. I didn't see him, and he is listening, so I want to make sure you have it.
Is this thing on? Okay. Well, listen, I've been through two new renegotiations. They're very difficult. Everybody's protecting, the cities and the counties are just, trying to get the biggest piece of pie. Please consider some sort of formula that takes it out of the city and the county's hands and is centric to the taxpayer, that's fair to all the taxpayers in the cities and the county, wherever they live. That, with maybe an option to negotiate, because a formula is hard to make that fits every one of the 159 counties. But if you could come up with something that says, okay, and do it soon, so everybody could be thinking about it for the next 8-10 years and be ready for it. Don't wait till a year before this thing goes live, because then it's more difficult. So if you, my hope would be that y'all could come up with some sort of data-driven formula that would say, this is how much the citizens get. Look at the citizens and try to be fair to them, and then we'll figure out at the city level and the county level what to do with our share. And if that formula is not perfect, give us the options to negotiate, where we don't have to get in this nosebleed fight every 10 years, because that's just what it comes down to. And I'd like to get away from that. So appreciate your listening to my 2 minutes. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Commissioner Farrell. And thanks to members of the committee. And you all have the information from ACCG to take home and digest with you. And let's also maybe just trade some emails as members of the committee to, put together a couple options that we can see a path forward on that the General Assembly can take up. And we'll share those with Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones, who's said he'd like to see something come out of the committee that could be put on paper. Coming out of this committee, said, "Now I don't have a committee just to meet. He said, come up with something." So would like for the committee to do that so we can maybe have some guardrails and put some rules back in play, and let's get something on the books. Thank y'all so much. And thank y'all for coming to Savannah.